The air was heavy with smoke. Ashes floated like black snow, covering the broken village. The houses were nothing but ruins. The ground was cracked, and the smell of death filled the air. She lay there in the dust. An alien widow with no family left. Her body was weak. Her stomach empty for many days. Her skin had turned pale, her eyes sunken, and flies crawled across her arms. She was too weak to fight them off. Her voice was dry, her lips bleeding. But she whispered the names of her lost children, hoping someone, anyone, would answer. But there was only silence. Her own people had abandoned her. When the war came, they ran, leaving the weak and the widows behind. She was not a fighter. She had no weapon, no strength, and no reason left to live. In her heart, she waited for death. The world was cruel, and she thought even the stars had forgotten her. But then there was a shadow. At first, she thought it was death itself, tall and strange, moving through the smoke. Her heart beat weakly in fear. And then she saw it clearly. It was a human. Humans were enemies. That was what she was taught. They were violent, dangerous, and cold. Her people had warned her never to trust them. But here he was, standing over her with tired eyes. He was dirty, wounded, and hungry himself. But alive, on his shoulder hung a torn bag, and in his hand was a small piece of food. Bread. Her eyes locked on the bread. Her stomach twisted in pain, but her mind screamed no. This was a human, an enemy. Surely he had come to finish her life. Surely he would laugh at her misery. But instead, he knelt down. The man looked at her with quiet pity. His face was rough, scarred by battle, but his eyes were kind. He pulled the last piece of bread from his bag. It was small, not enough even for him, yet he placed it gently in front of her cracked lips. The widow trembled. Her pride told her to refuse, but her body betrayed her. She wanted to live, even if just for one more hour. Her lips opened, and she took the bread. The taste was dry, hard. But to her, it was sweeter than any feast she had known. Her eyes filled with tears. Why would a human do this? Why save her when even her own people had left her to rot? Her voice cracked as she whispered, "Why? Help me." The human did not answer. Perhaps he did not understand her language. Perhaps he had no words at all. He simply watched her eat, his own stomach growling, and when she had finished, he gave her water from a dented bottle. The water spilled on her chin, but it gave her life again. For the first time in many days, the widow sat up, her body still weak. But her eyes had a spark of life. She studied the human with caution. Every story she had ever heard told her to run. But how could she run from the only soul who gave her food? The enemy was the one who saved her. The human who should have hated her was the one who cared. The ground shook suddenly. The war was not over. Explosions rumbled in the distance. And the human looked around with sharp eyes. He knew danger was near. He stood and offered her his hand. His palm was rough, his fingers strong. She hesitated, but slowly placed her hand in his. The human pulled her to her feet. Her legs shook. Her body swayed, but he held her steady. Together, they walked through the ruins. She could not understand his words, and he could not understand hers, yet, in silence, something passed between them. Something her own kind had forgotten mercy. The night fell quickly. The stars glowed faint above the smoke-filled sky. The human led her to a broken wall that still stood strong enough to give shelter. He sat her down, covered her with his worn jacket, and leaned against the stones. The widow looked at him, confused. She expected him to leave, but he stayed. He guarded her like a soldier guards his family. Her stomach no longer burned with hunger. Her throat was not dry anymore. Her heart was heavy with questions. Why would an enemy give his last meal? Why would he risk his life for her? Was this human different, or had she been wrong about humans all her life? She closed her eyes, listening to his slow breathing. And for the first time in years, she felt something she thought she had lost forever. Hope, the human, sat in silence beside the ruined wall, his back pressed against cold stone, his eyes scanning the shadows. The widow lay under his jacket, her breathing uneven. For hours he did not move, though his own body begged for rest. He had fought battles, lost brothers, and walked for days with no food. Now all he had was an empty bag, a half-broken knife, and his own stubborn will. He thought about the choice he had just made. He had given his last piece of bread to an alien, an enemy. It was madness. Soldiers would call him a fool. His captain would have ordered him to leave her to die. But when he saw her on the ground, covered in flies, he could not walk away. Her eyes had reminded him of someone, a face from home. He closed his eyes and saw his little sister. She too had starved once. During the first winter of war, he remembered breaking his own ration to keep her alive. That memory burned inside him. And when he saw the widow, he could not help but act. It was not about sides, not about war. It was about life. The night grew darker, and the air colder. The widow stirred, weakly trying to sit up. Her alien voice whispered something he could not understand, but he recognized the tone. It was gratitude. He gave her a small nod. His eyes soft, but his lips silent. He did not know how long she could survive. But if she lived one more day because of him, then his choice was right. At dawn, the sound of boots echoed in the distance. The human tensed, gripping his knife. Enemy. Patrols searching the ruins. He looked at the widow. If they found her, they would kill her for being weak. If they found him, they would kill him for being human. There was only one option. He motioned for her to stay quiet, pressing a finger to his lips. Then he pulled her deeper into the shadows of the broken wall. The widow's heart raced. She had no strength to run, no power to fight. All she could do was trust him, and trust was not easy. Her people had told her humans were monsters. But this human shielded her with his own body as soldiers passed nearby. She could hear their voices, angry and sharp. They were close enough that she could smell the iron of their weapons. Yet the human did not move. He stayed still as stone, his breath steady, his eyes fierce. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, the patrol moved on, their voices fading into the ruins. The widow let out a trembling breath. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with confusion. Why did he protect her? Why risk death for her? But he only shook his head as if telling her not to ask. The human knew that danger was growing. He could not stay in the village. If soldiers returned, both of them would die. He had to choose: leave her behind or take her with him. His chest tightened as he thought of leaving. It would be easier, safer. She was a burden, weak and wounded. Yet when he looked at her trembling hands and broken body, he knew the truth. He could not abandon her. So he chose to carry her. He bent down, lifting her into his arms. Her body was light, too light for someone alive. She gasped, weakly trying to protest, but his grip was firm. With slow steps, he walked out of the ruins, heading toward the forest beyond the hills. The path was dangerous, the land still crawling with scouts and hunters. But the trees offered cover, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to find food. The widow lay against his chest. She could hear his heartbeat, strong and steady. It comforted her in a way she did not understand. She wanted to hate him, but she could not. Each step he took was for her. Each breath he gave was to keep her safe. Her people had called humans cruel, but this one was gentle. By noon, they reached a stream. The human set her down and knelt to drink. He scooped water with his hands and offered it to her first. Her lips trembled as she drank. Then she tried to speak. She said one word, broken and strange in his ears. Why? He stared at her. Not. Knowing how to answer, he touched his chest, then pointed to her. A small gesture, simple but powerful. Her eyes widened. Understanding slowly, he was telling her she mattered, that her life was worth saving. The widow felt a strange warmth in her chest. For the first time since the war began, she believed she might live, not because of her people, but because of a human, a man who had nothing left, yet still chose to give. The day ended with the human building a small fire. He had no food, only the strength to keep them warm. He sat beside her, sharpening his broken knife. His face calm, though his stomach was empty. The widow studied him, her fear slowly fading. She realized something she had never thought possible. Her enemy had become her protector, and though she did not say it, she made a choice too. If he was willing to give his life for her, then she would not waste the gift he had given. She would. Live, she would walk beside him, no matter where the path led. The morning sun rose slowly over the forest. The light broke through the tall trees, touching the faces of the two unlikely companions. The human sat near the small fire, his knife in his hand, carving a piece of wood. The widow leaned against a rock, her body still weak, but her eyes sharper than before. For the first time in many days, she felt the warmth of life again. The human glanced at her often, as if to make sure she was still breathing. His own stomach ached with hunger, yet he stayed. Calm, he broke a branch into small sticks and set them near the fire. Every move was quiet, careful, as if he did not want to frighten her. The widow studied him. She tried to understand this strange man who had saved her. Her people had always told stories about human stories filled with cruelty and blood, but this one had not raised a weapon against her. He had shared food, water, even his jacket. She wanted to believe it was real, yet her heart still whispered. Doubt they could not speak the same words. When she tried, he tilted his head. Confused when he spoke, his voice was low and rough, but she could not understand. Still, they tried. He pointed at the sky and said, "Sun." She frowned, then whispered her word for it. Her voice was soft, almost broken. He repeated it, clumsy but eager. Then he smiled, the first smile she had seen in many days. And something inside her chest shifted. Every day, they added more words. She learned water, fire, and safe. He learned her words for hunger, fear, and home. They used their hands, their faces, their eyes to fill the spaces between words. Slowly, the silence between them became less heavy. At night, when the wind howled through the forest, they sat close to the fire. The human would hum softly, a low sound deep in his throat. She did not know it was music, but it calmed her, chasing away the shadows of war that haunted her sleep. When her nightmares woke her, she would find him sitting awake, knife in hand, keeping watch. And though she could not say it, her heart whispered a word she had not spoken in years: trust. One afternoon, the widow found her strength enough to walk a little. She followed the human as he searched the forest for food. They found berries, bitter but safe to eat. She gathered them with trembling fingers when she offered them to him. He shook his head and pushed the handful back toward her. But she pressed them into his hands, her eyes firm. For the first time, she gave something back. He accepted, with a quiet nod, and they ate together under the trees as the days passed. She began to tell him pieces of her story, not with words, but with gestures. She touched the ring around her finger. She pointed to the ground, as if showing a grave. Her eyes filled with tears. The human understood. She had lost someone she loved. He lowered his head in silence. He did not speak, but his hand rested on her shoulder, steady and strong. The touch said more than words ever could. The fragile bond between them grew. It was not built in speeches or promises. It was built in simple acts: sharing food, keeping watch, walking side by side through broken land. She began to notice how he always walked in front when danger might be near, how he gave her the better place by the fire, How he searched longer than he should for food so she would not starve. Her heart ached with confusion. Why would a human do all this? Why risk himself for her? The answer frightened her almost as much as it warmed her, but danger was never far. One night, as they rested near the forest edge, the sound of footsteps reached them, voices harsh and sharp, speaking her language, her people. The widow froze, her body torn in two. She wanted to call out, to let them know she was alive, but she looked at the human, crouched low with his knife ready, his eyes narrow with warning. If her people found him, they would kill him at once. If they saw her with him, they might kill her too, calling her a traitor. The voices came closer. She could see the glow of torches moving through the trees. Her heart pounded, her throat dry. The human motioned for silence. But one of the torches turned toward their hiding place. In a heartbeat, she made her choice. The widow stepped forward, covering him with her body. She pulled part of the broken wall over him, hiding him under the stones. Then she crouched down and closed her eyes, pretending to be weak, pretending to be nothing but a dying widow left behind. The patrol passed, their torches shining on her pale face. They muttered in disgust and moved on, calling her worthless. None of them saw the human hidden in the shadows. None of them knew she had chosen to protect him. When the danger passed, she pulled the stones away. Her hands bleeding, the human crawled out, his eyes wide. He looked at her in disbelief. For the first time, she had saved him. He opened his mouth, trying to speak, but no words came. Instead, he placed his hand over his heart and bowed his head. The meaning was clear. She was no longer just a burden. She was his partner. That night, the firelight danced between them. The widow stared at the human across the flames. Her fear of him was not gone. But it was fading, and in its place, something new was growing. A fragile bond, stronger than hunger, stronger than fear. A bond that neither war nor death had managed to break. The forest no longer felt safe. The human knew it, and the widow felt it too. After the patrol had passed, the silence was heavy, carrying the echo of danger. Both of them understood that if they stayed, sooner or later soldiers from either side would find them. And when that happened, there would be no mercy. The widow sat by the fire, her thin hands folded. Her eyes heavy with worry. She was still weak, but strength had begun to return to her body. The human watched her for a long time, thinking of the path ahead. His food was gone, his water almost empty, his knife chipped and dull. And yet he had made a choice. He would not leave her. If survival meant risk, then they would face it together at dawn. He put out the fire and packed what little they had. He motioned for her to rise, pointing toward the distant hills. Beyond the forest lay old ruins and broken roads. If they could pass through them, perhaps they could reach the far valleys where the war was weaker. The widow hesitated, but when he offered his hand, she placed hers in it. They walked together, step by step, away from the place they had hidden. The forest was thick, branches clawing at their clothes, roots twisting beneath their feet. Every sound made her heart jump. A crack of wood, the call of a crow, the rush of the river. The human moved with caution, always scanning ahead, his knife in his hand. He walked in front, and she followed, clutching the remains of his jacket tight around her shoulders. Though she could not speak his words, she felt his protection in every step he took. Hours passed, and the forest thinned into broken land. Shattered machines lay rusting in the grass. Bones scattered near them. The widow trembled at the sight. Was a battlefield, long abandoned, but still soaked with memory. The human's face hardened, his eyes cold as he led her through. He stepped carefully, avoiding helmets and shattered weapons. She watched him and realized he too carried ghosts. Though he never spoke of them, she could see the weight in his silence. By noon, the heat grew strong. The widow's legs shook, and her breath came heavy. The human noticed and stopped by the side of an old road. He knelt, drawing a picture in the dirt with a stick. He drew a mountain, then a line of trees, then a sun beyond them. She tilted her head, trying to understand. He pointed at the mountain, then at the horizon, then at her. He was telling her, "Beyond the mountain lies safety." She gave a faint smile, hope flickering in her heart, but the world did not let them rest long. As evening approached, voices echoed again. This time, not her people, not a small patrol, but soldiers, many of them. Their boots pounding the broken road, the human cursed. Under his breath, pulling her behind a ruined wall, through a crack, she saw the enemy march. Armored and armed, some were humans. Some were her own kind. Her eyes widened in fear. Neither side would spare them. To both, they were traitors. The human's jaw tightened. He held her hand and pulled her away from the road. Into the ruins, they ran quietly, their footsteps soft. On the broken stone, the widow's heart raced, each beat screaming of danger. Her body wanted to collapse, but his grip kept her moving. He guided her through the maze of crumbled buildings. Never slowing, never letting go, the soldiers' voices grew closer. Searching, calling, torches lit the night, their glow chasing shadows through the ruins. The widow stumbled, her foot striking a loose stone. It tumbled down the wall with a sharp clatter. Instantly, shouts rose. The human pulled her hard, pushing her into a dark corner as arrows struck the wall beside them. The widow bit her lip, holding back a cry. Fear burned in her chest, but so did something else, anger. She hated this war, hated the cruelty of it, but for the first time, she wanted to fight. The chase stretched on. Through alleys of stone and over piles of rubble, they fled. The human's breath was heavy, but his eyes never wavered. He was not running for himself, he was running for her. And she knew it. At last, they reached the edge of the ruins, where a wide river flowed. Its waters rushed fast, crashing against sharp rocks. The human looked back, soldiers still closing in. There was no choice. He turned to her, pointing at the water. Her eyes widened in shock. She shook her head, weak from hunger and fear, but his hand gripped hers tightly, his eyes fierce with determination. It was the only way. Together they plunged into the river. The cold struck like knives, dragging them down. The widow gasped, choking, her body struggling against the current. The human pulled her up, his arm tight around her waist. The river dragged them far, spinning them between waves and rocks. The world turned into chaos, water, darkness, breath stolen by the storm. At last, they washed ashore, coughing and shivering. The widow collapsed onto the sand, her body trembling. The human knelt beside her, pressing a hand to her back. They were alive, barely, but alive, as the moon rose above the river. The widow turned her face toward him, her lips parted, and in her broken voice she whispered one word. Together, the human looked at her for a long time, then nodded slowly. His eyes said the rest. He would not leave her. No matter where they had to run, that night, with the ruins behind them and the river between them and their pursuers, they rested under the stars, two souls bound not by blood, not by language, but by choice. The escape was not the end, only the beginning, and the path ahead promised even greater trials. The river had carried them far when dawn broke. The human and the widow lay on the wet ground, shivering and weak. Their clothes were torn, their bodies bruised, but their hearts still beat. They had escaped the soldiers, but now a greater enemy stood before them, hunger. The human rose slowly, his body stiff with pain. He searched the banks for anything to eat, turning over rocks, scanning the trees. There was nothing, only sand, sharp stones, and rushing water. His stomach burned with emptiness, and his throat felt raw from the river. But when he looked at the widow, lying pale and trembling, he pushed aside his own pain. She was weaker than him, and if she did not eat soon, she would not survive. The widow tried to rise, but her legs shook and gave way. She pressed her hand to her chest, her breath shallow. Her eyes lifted to him, and for the first time, she did not try to hide her fear. She whispered in her broken voice, "Food." The human knelt beside her. Placing a hand on her shoulder, he nodded, though he had nothing to give. He would find something, somehow. Hours passed as he searched the forest near the river. The widow stayed behind, her body too weak to follow. Every sound of rustling leaves made her heart race. What if he never returned? What if he chose to leave her behind? But deep inside, she knew he would come back. He had not abandoned her before, and she believed he would not now. The human returned as the sun reached high. In his hands he carried roots, bitter herbs, and a handful of berries. It was not much, but it was life. He gave it all to her first. The widow frowned, shaking her head, pushing the food toward him, but he insisted. Pressing it back into her hands, her eyes filled with tears. He was starving, yet he chose her. Again and again, she ate slowly, saving half for him when she offered it back. He hesitated, then accepted. Together, they shared the bitter meal. The taste was rough, but to them it was hope. For the first time in days, they ate side by side. Their hunger eased just enough to keep walking. As they traveled, the widow began to change. Though her body was frail, her spirit grew stronger. She no longer waited for him to do everything. She gathered wood for fires. She searched for water. She even carried sticks to make walking easier. When she stumbled, she forced herself up again. And when he looked at her with worry, she gave him a small smile. She wanted him to see she was not only a burden, she wanted him to know she was trying. One night, as they sat near a small fire, she pointed at herself, then at him, her lips shaped a word in her language, family. The human tilted his head. Not understanding, she tried again, pointing at her heart, then at him. Then pressing her hands together. Slowly, he understood. She was calling him family. His eyes softened. And though he could not repeat her word, he pressed his fist to his chest. A soldier's gesture of loyalty in that moment. They both knew the truth. Hunger had not broken them. It had bound them together. Days turned into weeks. They walked through valleys of broken stone, through forests where no birds sang, through fields where the war had left scars deeper than wounds. The human grew thinner, his face sharper, his arms weary. Yet he carried her across rivers, lifted her over walls, and fought for scraps of food. The widow, too, began to change. Her steps grew steadier, her voice clearer when he bled from a cut. She tore her dress to bandage him when he coughed from thirst. She searched until she found water. She gave him back what she could, piece by piece. One evening, as the sun fell red across the hills, they found themselves cornered. Not by soldiers, but by hunger itself. There was no food left, and the widow saw him stumble. His steps slowed, his breath shallow, his skin pale. For the first time, she saw him failing. He had given too much, sacrificed too often. Her heart ached with fear she could not lose him. She left him by a tree and went alone into the ruins nearby. Every shadow terrified her. Every sound made her shake. But she forced herself forward, searching. At last, she found an old storehouse. Broken but not empty. Inside were rusted cans and dried roots. She carried what she could back to him, her arms trembling but her spirit strong, when the human saw her return with food. His eyes widened. She knelt beside him, placing the food in his hands. "Eat," she whispered, her voice firm. This time, he did not refuse. They shared the meal beneath the stars. It was not enough to fill them, but enough to keep them alive. The widow leaned against him as the fire crackled low. Her voice was quiet, but steady. She repeated the words she had taught him before. Family. The human looked at her, His tired face softening, he touched her hand, his rough fingers warm, though he had no words to answer. His silence was enough. That night they did not feel like enemies. They did not feel like strangers from different worlds. They felt like two souls bound by hunger, hope, and the simple choice to keep each other alive. And in the deep silence of the night, both of them knew. They were no longer alone. The days of walking had taken everything from them. Their bodies were thin, their clothes torn, their steps slow. But even with weakness pressing on their shoulders, they kept moving. Each night they built small fires. Each morning they searched for food. The bond between them had grown strong. But the world did not care about bonds. The world was still full of war. One evening, they reached an old temple standing at the edge of the hills. Its walls were cracked, its towers broken, but it still rose tall against the sky. The widow stopped and touched the cold stones. Her people once prayed here, long before the war. Now it was only ruins. Filled with shadows, the human guided her. Inside, hoping for shelter, they lit a fire in the center hall, resting under the broken roof where the stars shone through. For a moment, there was peace. The widow leaned against him, her eyes heavy with sleep. The human sharpened his knife, his face calm but his mind alert. He knew this peace would not last. He was a soldier, and soldiers felt danger before it arrived, and it did arrive in the dead of night. The sound of boots echoed through the temple. Torches burned in the distance, voices carried through the ruined halls. Soldiers, many of them, moving with purpose. The human rose to his feet, his knife gleaming in the firelight. The widow's heart pounded as she clutched his arm. She whispered one word, "Run." But he shook his head, his eyes fierce. There was no running now. The temple was surrounded. The human looked at her with steady eyes. He pointed to himself. Then to the entrance, then to her. His meaning was clear. He would fight. He would buy her time. The widow shook her head, tears filling her eyes. She could not leave him. Not now, not after everything. Her hands trembled, but she picked up a broken spear from the floor. The wood was cracked, the blade rusted, but it was still a weapon. For the first time, she stood ready to fight. The soldiers entered the hall, their shadows long against the firelight. They saw the human and shouted, raising their blades. Some of them were her people, some were his, but all of them carried the same hunger for blood. The human stepped forward, his knife flashing. The widow stood beside him, her spear shaking in her grip. Together, they faced the storm. The first soldier lunged, and the human struck fast. His knife cutting through the darkness, another rushed from the side, and the widow swung the spear with all her strength. The blade scraped across armor, not killing, but pushing the enemy back. Her arms ached, but she held firm. The human fought. Like a beast, every strike fueled by the fire of survival. He blocked a sword with his arm, the blade cutting deep, but he did not fall. Blood ran down his sleeve, but his eyes never wavered. The widow cried out, fear burning in her chest. She struck again, this time harder. The spear sinking into an enemy's leg. The soldier screamed and fell, and the widow froze, staring at what she had done. But the human pulled her close. His voice sharp. Fight, he growled. Even if she did not understand the word, she understood the meaning, and she did. The temple became a storm of steel and fire. The sound of blades clashing, the shouts of soldiers, the crack of stone as walls shook. The widow's arms grew heavy, her body weak, but she forced herself forward. Every time she thought she would fall, she saw him still fighting, bleeding, refusing to give up. He was her strength, and she became his. The battle seemed endless, but slowly the fire of the soldiers began to fade. One by one, they fell or fled. Leaving only silence in the broken hall, the human dropped to his knees, his body covered in wounds. Ow. The widow rushed to his side, throwing down the spear. She pressed her hands to his bleeding arm, her eyes wide with panic. "Stay," she whispered. Her voice breaking, he looked at her, his lips curved in a faint smile. He had fought many battles, but never one like this. Never for someone like her. The widow tore strips from her dress. Binding his wounds with trembling hands, she would not let him go, not after all he had given. Her tears fell onto his skin, but her voice grew steady. "You live," she said, the words rough but clear. The human touched her cheek with his blood-stained hand, his eyes full of quiet pride. He had seen her fight. He had seen her stand. She was no longer the dying widow he had found in the dust. She was his partner, his equal. The fire burned low. The hall filled with smoke and silence. They sat together in the ruins, broken but alive. The widow leaned against him, her hand never leaving his. The night was long, but the dawn would come. And when it did, they would walk again, not as strangers, not as enemies, but as two souls who had stood together against the world. The dawn came at last. The light of morning spilled through the broken roof of the temple, shining on blood and stone. The fire had died. The smoke rising in thin trails toward the sky. The human sat against the wall, his body wrapped in torn cloth where the widow had bound his wounds. He was pale, his breath slow, but his eyes were still open. The widow sat beside him, her head resting against his shoulder, her hand clutching his tightly. They had survived the night. But survival felt like a fragile dream. Outside, the world was quiet. The soldiers who had attacked were gone, their footprints fading into the dust. For now, there was peace. The widow stood and looked at the rising sun, her thin body trembling with exhaustion. Yet when she turned back to him, her eyes burned. With determination, she would not let him fall here. She would not let his sacrifice end in silence. Slowly, she helped him to his feet. His arm rested heavy on her shoulders, but she did not waver. Step by step, they walked out of the ruined temple, leaving behind the battlefield where they had fought side by side, every stone, every crack in the wall seemed to whisper their story, not as enemies, but as partners. Not as soldier and widow, but as family. The road ahead was long. The human leaned on her, his strength fading. Yet he smiled faintly when he saw her holding him up. She was not the weak, dying figure he had found in the dirt. She had risen because of him, and now she carried him. Together they walked. Through valleys scarred by war, across rivers where broken bridges hung, through forests where silence pressed heavy. Each step was pain, but also proof that they were still alive. Days passed, and their hunger returned, sharper than ever. They found little roots, wild fruit, dirty water from broken streams, but they shared it all. Never taking more than the other, the human grew thinner, his wounds slow to heal. The widow cared for him, searching each day, pressing herbs into his cuts, whispering soft words in her language as she worked. He did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. Her voice was no longer filled with fear. It was filled with love. One night, as they sat by a small fire, she looked at him, her eyes wet with tears. She touched her heart, then touched his chest. Her lips formed the word she had given him before. Family. The human stared at her, his throat tight. He reached out, his rough hand brushing her cheek. In his language, he whispered a single word: home. Though she did not know the sound, she felt its meaning. And for the first time since war had stolen everything from her, she smiled, but peace never lasted. One morning, they heard voices in the hills, more soldiers hunting for survivors. The human knew he could not fight again, his body too broken. The widow knew she could not protect him alone. For a moment, fear gripped them both, but then she looked into his eyes and found her strength. This time, she would not hide behind him. This time, she would stand in front. As the soldiers drew closer, she pulled him into the shadows of a broken wall. She gripped her spear, her hands steady, her heart no longer beat only for herself. It beat for him, and if death came, she would face it, not as a victim, but as someone who had learned courage from a human who gave everything but the soldiers did not come near. Their voices faded as they marched past, their boots echoing on the stones. The widow sank to her knees, relief flooding her. The human placed a weak hand on her shoulder, his eyes shining. She had saved him again. Not with a weapon, but with her will to protect. Together they kept walking, far from the ruins. Far from the war, the land slowly changed. The smoke of burning fields was replaced by the green of untouched hills. The broken cities gave way to valleys where flowers still grew. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the air smelled of life, not death. They stopped at the edge of a wide meadow. The human collapsed to the ground, exhausted. The widow knelt beside him, cradling his head in her lap. Her tears fell freely, not from fear, but from something stronger. Hope, she whispered to him, though she knew he would not understand. You gave me life when all had left me. You gave me food when you had none. You gave me hope when I was already dead. Now I will give you the same. Until my last breath, the human's lips curved into a faint smile. He closed his eyes, but not in death, only in rest. The widow sat there, watching the horizon. The sun was warm, the sky endless. She knew the war would still rage somewhere far away. But here, in this place, they had found something stronger than war. They had found each other from that day forward. The widow no longer thought of herself as abandoned. She was no longer the starving woman left in the dirt. She was the one who had been saved by a human's last meal. And in return, she had saved him with her will to keep going. Together, they were proof that kindness could cross every border, every wound, every lie. Together, they were more than survivors. They were family. And as the wind moved through the meadow, carrying their story into the distance, the stars above seemed to whisper the truth. He had given her his last meal, but she had given him something far greater, a reason to live.